Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along in person, and to the people who've streamed online for our third talk of my Ireland in 1924 series. So we're going to talk about the Irish Free State Army Mutiny of 1924 today, and the next week we've got two talks. One is on the dissolution of Dublin Corporation, also 1924, on Tuesday, and then on Thursday we've got the Taunton Games from 1924. Both being held in Rathmines Library and both being streamed online. So, as per normal, happy to take questions at the end of the talk. If you're streaming online, you can type the questions in, and my colleague Alison will ask me the questions. And I will make sure to read out or call out the actual questions so people can understand what the question is. So with that, I'm going to start the talk. On Thursday, 6th of March 1924, disgruntled Irish Free State Army officers, led by Liam Tobin and Charlie Dalton, abandoned their posts, seized weapons, and delivered an ultimatum to the government, demanding that the Army Council resign, the process of demobilisation that began after the Civil War ended be halted, that they receive prominent commands, that the Army be purged of former British Army officers, and that more progress be made on achieving Michael Collins's goal to end partition and bring about a republic. Although the mutiny ended up being mainly bloodless, it was the biggest threat to the Free State since the ending of the Civil War in May 1923. It resulted in significant political changes and in civilian control of the Army. Today, I will look at the causes and events that led to the mutiny, the events that transpired at the time, and the political and military fallout from it. As the Civil War was reaching its end in the spring of 1923, the Free State government knew it would soon have to come up with plans to radically reduce the size of its bloated army, which at one stage was 55,000 strong. The army alone was costing the government £10 million a year, an astronomical sum, particularly given the perilous financial position the fledgling Free State was in. Also, compensation payments for damaged and destroyed property was expected to exceed £10 million by the end of 1924. The flotation of a national loan in early 1924 helped with the cost of the Civil War, but the Department of Finance relentlessly pursued reductions across the board in all sections of public expenditure. As the conflict petered out in April and May of 1923, there was simply no need for such a large army anymore. The Free State was also seeking entry to the League of Nations at the time, and the League Secretariat queried the size of the Defence Forces, asking whether Ireland was in conformity with the term of the League's covenant concerning disarmament. The Irish Free State government responded and placed in law that it would accept League recommendations on the size of Ireland's military. By 1st of June 1923, shortly after the Civil War had ended, there were 49,000 soldiers in the Free State Army. And here are Free State Army troops at the Civil War Victory Parade in the Phoenix Park in Dublin on 22nd of August 1923, exactly a year after Michael Collins was killed. There were still 3,000 commissioned officers by September 1923. Responsibility for the demobilisation task rested mainly on the shoulders of Richard Mulcahy. Mulcahy was Commander-in-Chief of the Army, as well as Minister for Defence in the Executive Council of the government. Problematic for some, but he held both civilian and military roles. He planned to reduce the army to between 28,000 and 30,000 by the end of 1923. This was revised to reduce the numbers even more 6 months later to just under 20,000 and 1,396 commissioned officers. To help soften the blow of thousands of men leaving the army at the same time, Mulcahy suggested to Joseph McGrath, Minister for Labour, to give preference to ex-army men at labour exchanges. The Executive Council backed his proposals to give temporary jobs, such as positions of clerks, porters, messengers, public park keepers, to ex-army men. Special provision for them to be offered in civil service examinations, 10% of the workforce in public bodies to be taken up by ex-army men, rising to 50% for road construction work, and loans provided to them to buy land under the 1923 Land Act terms. Good redundancy terms were granted to officers. The implementation of the plans proved difficult, though, with many protests ensuing. Sean McCone, the GOC of Western Command, complained that to his mind, the scheme is so preposterous that one could speak on the matter for days. Another scheme was approved by the Executive Council in early 1924. Even though there was good interdepartmental cooperation and various employment initiatives, the already depressed employment market was unable to assimilate thousands of demobilised soldiers. Demobilisation payments provided some small help. Some of the biggest problems arose, though, over some of the higher-ranking officers with long track records dating back to the War of Independence. There already had been tensions with these men before the Civil War ended. Mulcahy initially shied away from dealing with the pre-truce officers, especially those who wanted to stay in the army. According to former Taoiseach Garret Fitzgerald, whose father Desmond served in the first Cumann Gael government, the origins of the army mutiny seem to have lain in the fact that Michael Collins appointed to the leadership of the army in the Civil War fellow members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB, but not members of his loyal followers, the Active Service Unit, or Squad, who owed a special loyalty to him, but who he seems to have seen in a different light from those he put in charge of the army. If Collins had survived, that might not have mattered, but after his death, it proved immensely divisive. Many of the people Fitzgerald referred to were in the National Army Intelligence Unit based at Wellington Barracks on South Circular Road, or the Criminal Investigation Unit, CID, based in Oriel House on Westland Road during the Civil War. Fiercely loyal to Collins, his squad carried out some of the most difficult, dangerous and dirty acts during the War of Independence, including assassinations and close-range shootings. They were responsible for implementing the attacks on Bloody Sunday morning, as well as engaging in other high-profile killings in Dublin throughout the conflict. During the Civil War, this was the same group, as John Dorney has written, who had formed the core of the murder gang in Dublin, the same group who had been behind much of the torture of prisoners, and the same group who had been ousted from their position in army intelligence in the army reorganisation of late 1922 and early 1923. They were led by Liam Tobin, Charlie Dalton, Frank Thornton and Tom Cullen, the surviving members of Collins's pre-truce IRA intelligence service. The murder gang was responsible for a series of reprisal killings that seemed to start immediately after the death of Michael Collins in August 1922. Two Fianna members, 19-year-old Sean Cole and 21-year-old Alf Colley, were abducted and shot dead on 26th of August, while Collins was lying in state in Dublin City Hall. And here is an illustration by Countess Markovics of the Cole and Colley killings. An IRA volunteer, Bernard Daly, was also abducted separately and shot dead on the same day. Similar killings continued to the end of the Civil War and even beyond. One of the most notorious incidents was the abduction in broad daylight of Noel Lamass in July 1923, with his tortured and decomposed body found in October of that year in the Dublin Mountains. And here's a memorial to Noel Lamass in Dublin Mountains. According to Brian Hanley, after Collins' death, they were overwhelmed with a desire for revenge, but all robbed on the one leader who could control them. They usually killed in retaliation for the loss of close comrades, and they had long memories. Hanley also points out that while a majority of IRA volunteers in Dublin, after the Easter Rising at least, never engaged in armed action again, the squad had been full-time activists, constantly on the run and living on the edge. There is no doubt some of them were brutalised by the experience. Prior to the Civil War, many of the group had already gained a reputation for heavy drinking and erratic behaviour. Members of Collins' squad did not all remain in Dublin during the Civil War. Its former commander, Paddy O'Daly, seen here holding the tricolour, was responsible for some of the worst atrocities committed during the Civil War in Kerry, including at Ballyseedy. Aware of the many extrajudicial killings and other incidents of violence perpetrated by members of the National Army, ministers of the Executive Council of the Free State including Richard Mulcahy and the President, W.T. Cosgrave, turned a blind eye, and no action was taken against the culprits until the Civil War was over. In fact, one person who was killed, UCD student Bobby Bonfield, was arrested by Cosgrave's personal escort at St. Stephen's Green in March 1923 in front of Cosgrave. The IRA man's body was found at Clondalkin a few hours later. While some army members were convicted for murder after the conflict ended in May 1923, many were not convicted, even though there was sufficient evidence of army involvement in post-Civil War killings. Kevin O'Higgins, as Minister of Home Affairs, was responsible for the Gardaí led by Owen O'Duffy. O'Higgins' rivalry with Mulcahy, which formed a key component of the Army Mutiny saga, was increasing throughout 1923. O'Higgins, as well as fellow Executive Council members Desmond Fitzgerald and Patrick Hogan, were allies known as the Donnybrook Set, who were considered less interested in issues such as the Irish language and republicanism. They were considered more civilian-orientated, who advocated for a parliamentary democracy with less militarism in the state. O'Higgins was wary of Mulcahy and the Army Council and their involvement with the IRB secret society. This wariness became more pronounced as the Free State transitioned from conflict in the summer of 1923 to more stabilised conditions. O'Higgins was also unhappy with army indiscipline and with the unwillingness of the army leaders to deal with this problem. O'Higgins, Hogan and Fitzgerald wanted civilian control of the army, an army that would not be influenced by secret societies such as the IRB, and a new one founded by Liam Tobin, the IRA organisation. Cork-born Liam Tobin was part of the Four Courts garrison commanded by Edward Daly during the Easter Rising. Following the surrender, Tobin's death penalty was commuted to 10 years penal servitude. After his release from Pentonville in June 1917, he became a Dublin Brigade intelligence officer, as well as collaborating with Michael Collins in founding the New Ireland Assurance Company. Throughout the War of Independence and the Anglo-Irish treaty negotiations in London, Tobin, Frank Thornton and Tom Cullen were a semi-autonomous triumvirate of GHQ intelligence officers directly responsible to Collins. They were responsible for guarding Collins and directing his squad of assassins. So loyal was Tobin to Collins that his acceptance of the treaty Collins had signed was never in doubt. He accepted Collins's explanation that the treaty was a stepping stone to achieve further freedoms. With the transition from guerrilla warfare to a regular army in 1922, Tobin became an acting Major General of the National Army. He accompanied Emmett Dalton as an intelligence officer during the seaborne landing at Passage West on 8 August 1922, and was in Cork at the time of Collins's death 2 weeks later, but was not at Ballinavlaw. For a brief stint from October to December 1922, Tobin acted as Director of Intelligence and ex officio member of the Army Council. However, he became aide-de-camp to the Governor-General Tim Healy in January 1923, an honorary position with no powers. Increasingly disillusioned with the trajectory of the Free State political leaders, as well as the marginalisation of of independence veterans in the National Army, as he saw it, Tobin founded the IRA organisation in early 1923 with Colonel Charles Dalton, brother of Emmett, and a number of other men who were loyal to Collins. The IRAO contended that a hostile IRB clique ran the Army Council, and the goals of Collins had been abandoned. Dublin-born Charles Dalton was only 13 when the Easter Rising took place. Although not engaged in the fighting, it had a profound effect on him, far more so than the First World War, even though his older brother Emmett was on the front in Europe at the time. Charlie joined the Dublin Brigade, aged just 14, in 1918. He wrote a book about his experiences in 1929 called With the Dublin Brigade. He swiftly rose to the ranks of the IRA during the War of Independence, firstly assisting the squad before joining Collins's intelligence unit. He was an active participant in the killings on the morning of Bloody Sunday, 21st November 1920, aged just 17 at the time. After the truce, Charlie Dalton was appointed second in command of GHQ intelligence at Oriel House. In March 1922, he became Lieutenant Commandant. During the Civil War, allegations of brutality were made against him, and he was transferred to staff duties before being appointed Adjutant of the Army Air Service. He was demoted from Colonel to Commandant in February 1924 and acted as Secretary of the IRAO. According to Army intelligence, the IRAO's intention was to get in touch with all IRA men serving in the National Army, and if they believed in our ideals, to link them together in an organisation which, when strong enough, would demand a strong voice in Army policy with a view to securing complete independence when a suitable occasion arose. Members of the IRAO had carried out some of the most difficult and traumatising episodes of the War of Independence and felt aggrieved that, with their leader dead, they were being sidelined by the IRB, who took their positions on the Army Council, by those who had previously served with the British Army, and by some who had seen no action in the War of Independence, so-called Fusiliers. In the publication of the IRAO, The Truth About the Army Crisis, its members felt there was an immediate hostility shown, both openly and in secret, to us, Michael Collins' officers, and a policy adopted of either placing us in show positions outside the Army or of giving us positions within it, which we could have no power to carry on his work and make the Army what he intended it should be. With Kevin O'Higgins deeply concerned about the revival of the IRB and its apparent hold on the Army Council, and with Joseph McGrath, the Minister for Industry and Commerce, who had been seconded to the Army as Director of Intelligence during the Civil War, being sympathetic to the IRAO members' grievances, the Free State government decided to listen to their concerns. An IRAO deputation met with Cosgrave and Mulcahy in June 1923. A document outlining the IRAO's position was presented at the meeting, which, as Owen Kinsella has written, included an extraordinary threat. Unless satisfactory arrangements are come to between us, our organisation will take whatever steps they consider necessary to bring about an honest, cleaner and more genuine effort to secure a republic. According to the IRAO, Mulcahy refused to consider the document and, by abruptly leaving the room, brought the meeting to an end. Mulcahy, aghast of the attempt by subordinates to dictate military policy and plans, subsequently met IRAO members again, but soon broke off all contact with the IRAO. The IRAO claimed that Mulcahy promised that they would have representation on the governing body of the IRB, but this promise was broken by a member of the Army Council. The IRAO members also wanted to know why they, as old IRB members, were not advised of its reorganisation and asked to participate in its activities. After being spurned of membership of the governing body of the IRB, the IRAO felt it was futile to maintain contact with Mulcahy. Relations between Mulcahy and the IRAO deteriorated further in November 1923, when 7 officers in the Cormac camp refused to accept their demobilisation orders. This number soon rose to 60. Eventually, they were forcibly removed from the Curragh and expelled without pay. Mulcahy was becoming more and more marginalised within the Executive Council, particularly as his relationship with O'Higgins and McGrath worsened. After the 60 IRA officers were expelled without pay, the government moved to establish a committee comprising of O'Macneil, Ernest Bly and McGrath to supervise future demobilisation. And after a threat by McGrath to resign from the committee, the government eventually agreed that the committee could act retrospectively with regard to past demobilisations, a measure that clearly undermined the Army Council's authority. By early 1924, Mulcahy was aware of the strong possibility of a mutiny, but did little to prevent it by alleviating anxieties. The IRAO claims that since its inception in early 1923, the Secret Service agents became very active. Spies were employed to dog our footsteps. Dictaphones to record our conversations were placed in offices where we were likely to meet. Also, for the IRAO, within the army itself, the rot continued. The denationalising policy was carried on apace. Events proved that our fears were only too well founded. Large numbers of officers with excellent records were demobilised without getting a fair opportunity to prove their fitness. In the commissioned ranks or even non-commissioned ranks, while the army became studded with officers, NCOs and men, not only without any national record, but with ex-British and post-truce records, and in a large number of cases holding hostile views to the true national outlook. It was time to act. On 6th of March 1924, the IRAO sent an ultimatum signed by Liam Tobin and Charlie Dalton to the Free State government. They stated that their position was that the IRA only accepted the treaty as a means of achieving its objects, namely to secure and maintain a Republican form of government in this country. After many months of discussion with your government, it is our considered opinion that your government has not these objects in view, and that their policy is not reconcilable with the Irish people's acceptance of the treaty. They also stated that the IRAO's interpretation of the treaty was that expressed by the late Commander-in-Chief, General Michael Collins, when he stated, "I have taken an oath of allegiance to the Irish Republic, and that oath I will keep, treaty or no treaty." We claim Michael Collins as our leader, and again remind you that even after the treaty was signed, that drastic action was taken against enemies of the unity and complete independence of our country. Both in oath and honour bound, it is our duty to continue this policy, and therefore present the ultimatum to which we require a reply by 12 noon, 10th of March 1924. We demand a conference with representatives of your government to discuss our interpretation of the treaty on the following conditions: the removal of the Army Council, the immediate suspension of army demobilisation and reorganisation. In the event of your government rejecting these proposals, we will take such action that will make clear to the Irish people that we are not renegades or traitors to the ideals that induced them to accept the treaty. Our organisation fully realises the seriousness of the action that we may be compelled to take, but we can no longer be party to the treachery and threatens to destroy the aspirations of the nation. As news of the mutiny spread, about 50 officers throughout the country declared their support for the mutineers in places like Roscommon, Gormanstown, Baldonnel and Templemore barracks. Around 50 more officers resigned, particularly from the Dublin command. Some absconded with arms and equipment. The Army Chief of Staff, Sean McMahon, feared that unless steps were taken at once, with great tact and firmness, the army will develop into an armed mob shortly. While there was much anxiety initially, the Army Council's response was swift and decisive. Mutiny would not be tolerated. The army must not be involved in any political crisis, even if the crisis develops from the mutiny, but must be forced into a military machine that will be the right arm of any government that people wish to place in power. The government issued a statement to the press. Orders have been issued for the arrest of 2 officers of the National Forces, Major General Liam Tobin and Colonel Charles Dalton, who are charged with mutiny. For the purpose of effecting their arrest, several houses in Dublin were visited by a party of military last night, but without result. The 2 officers are at present evading arrest. Mulcahy also issued a statement to the press. 2 army officers have attempted to involve the army in a challenge to the authority of the government. This is an outrageous departure from the spirit of the army. It would not be tolerated. Particularly will it not be tolerated by the officers and men of the army who cherish its honour. They will stand over their posts and do their duty today in this new threat of danger in the same watchful, determined spirit that has always been the spirit of the army. Speaking in the Dáil on 11th of March, Cosgrave called a mutiny a challenge to the democratic foundation of the state, to the very basis of parliamentary representation and of responsible government. Despite having met with the IRAO on more than one occasion the previous year, Cosgrave declared he would refuse to discuss any of the political issues mentioned in the ultimatum, misleadingly claiming that this government has never discussed questions of politics with army officers. He said that orders have been issued for the arrest of the signatories to the document. The personnel of the headquarters staff has been strengthened by the appointment of General Owen O'Duffy to be General Officer commanding the Defence Forces. Measures have already been taken throughout the country to deal with any situation which may arise, and nothing will be left undone to secure that the discipline of the army will be maintained. Mulcahy, who was humiliated by the appointment of O'Duffy as GOC, explained the military threats, saying there is a certain atmosphere of threat that a large number of officers throughout the army are preparing to resign if the threat contained in the letter to the government is not carried out. That they are prepared to set themselves up in arms in defiance against the government is another threat. The government and army's swift actions suggested they were on top of the threat. but matters took a twist by the intervention of one of the government's own ministers, Joe McGrath. After Cosgrave made his statement, McGrath announced his resignation as Minister for Industry and Commerce, which he said was brought about by absolute muddling, mishandling and incompetency on the part of a department of the state, the Department of Defence. McGrath, along with 8 other TDs, resigned from Cumann Gael and formed the National Group. They resigned en bloc from Dáil Éireann in October 1924. He subsequently became a very wealthy man through his role as director of the Irish Hospitals Sweepstakes. Following McGrath's resignation, Cumann Gael held several meetings throughout the country where there was significant support for the mutineers. During the meetings, McGrath was convincing, while the silent Mulcahy was not. Defending the mutineers, McGrath claimed that the government had misunderstood their motives and overreacted to the ultimatum. It was not mutiny, but rather a dispute between the 2 rival secret organisations, the IRB and the IRAO. Allowances should be made for men who had given much to the country in the past. In McGrath's opinion, the government was truly worried only about its image and the adverse publicity this incident could generate. O'Higgins and the Donnybrook set saw an opportunity in the crisis to minimise the influence secret societies such as the IRB and IRAO had over the army. What was initially a military crisis became a political one as disagreements spilled out into the Executive Council. Mulcahy was clearly upset at the Executive Council's decision to appoint O'Duffy as Army GOC. Yet bizarrely, he remained quiet during the debate on the army charges within the Cumann Gael party and the Executive Council. Fearing the damage McGrath could do with an inflammatory speech and with the IRAO willing to negotiate, the government decided to deal with the mutineers and agreed to an army inquiry. Kevin O'Higgins took charge of matters for the government at this juncture. According to Garret Fitzgerald, speaking years later, long afterwards, both General Michael Costello and General Sean McKeown said that what actually happened was that Cosgrave had been hoping that O'Higgins would overreact and might leave the government. And there is an implication that O'Higgins had charged him with such a ploy and had then required him to retire for a period with a diplomatic illness. Certainly, Mrs. Mulcahy later said that Mrs. Cosgrave had visited her during the crisis and had told her that O'Higgins wanted Cosgrave to resign. Whatever the truth of all that, O'Higgins took over de facto control of the government. It seemed a week after the ultimatum was delivered that the crisis was over. However, Michael Costello, seen here in the centre, who was head of Army Intelligence, was listening in on the phone calls of Tobin and Dalton and concluded that they were planning a coup to include the assassination of government ministers. Mulcahy and the Army Council ordered the arrest of mutineers on 18th of March while they were meeting at Devlin's Hotel on Parnell Street. Crucially, neither the Army Council nor Mulcahy notified other members of the Executive Council. In the ensuing raid of Devlin's, 11 armed army officers were arrested, while several others escaped. Instead of the government being grateful that the mutineers were in custody, mutineers it seemed who were willing to kill some of their number, and even though the Cabinet Secretary, Dermot O'Hegarty, had allegedly approved the raid, the Free State Executive Council considered the raid a reckless and dangerous move that could have triggered a gun battle and started a new civil war. O'Higgins and his colleagues, having secured Cosgrave's consent at his home first, demanded the resignation of the entire Army Council, Chief of Staff General Sean McMahon, Adjutant General Garrod O'Sullivan, Quartermaster General Charna Murtahilly. The 3 men resigned their positions in the army as directed, and as a mark of their disgust at how they were treated, they also resigned their commissions, a move that had not been sought by the government. Realising the writing was on the wall, Mulcahy resigned in protest as Minister for Defence before he was ousted. And here are the 4 men who resigned. Speaking in the Dáil after the Devlin Hotel raid, O'Higgins said, "One cannot deal with last night's incidents simply as isolated incidents. It is clear that the army situation has been unsound for a very considerable time back, that there was a very grave menace, what I describe as an abscess reacting on the general health and the general morale of that organisation. To what extent it was there with the full knowledge of the responsible heads of the army and with the full knowledge of the minister responsible for the army is a matter with the 3 gentlemen who have been appointed to this grave task must inquire into. That inquiry will proceed. Well, on the one hand, Tobin, Dalton and the other mutineers were treated softly and allowed to resign with pensions once most of the stolen arms and ammunition were secured. On the other hand, the Army Council and Mulcahy were treated very harshly, with the Irish Times editorialising that mutiny has been condoned and resignation has been the fate of those responsible persons who refused to condone it. After holding several positions in the private sector, including working for Joe McGrath, Tobin ended up in the civil service as superintendent of the Oireachtas at Leinster House between November 1940 until his retirement in December 1959. Charlie Dalton also worked for Joe McGrath in an executive position at the Irish Hospital Sweepstakes before illness forced his early retirement. The Army inquiry that Cosgrave promised in March to look into the causes of the mutiny took place from the beginning of April to the beginning of June. Chaired by Justice James Creed Meredith, who had played a prominent role in establishing the Dáil courts during the War of Independence, the Army Inquiry Committee met on 41 occasions and heard detailed statements from 27 witnesses, including Mulcahy, O'Higgins and the members of the Army Council who were dismissed. In his opening statement, former Chief of Staff Sean McMahon provided insight into his feelings about his dismissal. I cannot help feeling a sting of degradation when I reflect on the work of the years that have passed and sit here now accused of having done something, although that something is not quite clear to anybody, to disrupt the Army and pull down the edifice we've spent so many years and so much energy in building up. The main conclusions of the report of the Army Inquiry Committee issued to the Executive Council on 7th of June was that Joe McGrath's claims of the Army Council being incompetent were not justified. The Army Council had acted fairly and honestly on the very sensitive issue of demobilisation, particularly of officers. It concluded that many of the officers selected for demobilisation had become a problem even before Michael Collins's death and were too ill-disciplined and temperamentally unsuited to the demands of peacetime and of a professional military, one of the principal reasons they had been sidelined in the first place. The report was not complimentary towards Mulcahy either, particularly over his failure to inform the government of the reorganisation of the IRB, a disastrous error of judgment the committee felt. Mulcahy defended himself in the Dáil, saying the report omitted to mention that Cosgrave, O'Higgins and O. McNeill were aware of the IRB reorganisation in June 1923. Mulcahy also took issue with the report condemning his handling of the so-called Kenmare incident case. The Kenmare incident occurred in June 1923 when 21-year-old Florence Flossie and 19-year-old Jessie McCarthy were physically assaulted, with one account alleging they were also sexually assaulted by members of the Dublin Guard in Kerry, including Paddy O'Daly. While Mulcahy set up a military court of inquiry to investigate the attacks, it was a sham, and most of the alleged perpetrators, including O'Daly, were declared innocent. Speaking in June 1924, Mulcahy defended his actions over the Kenmare incident, saying the Attorney General Hugh Kennedy had ruled there was no evidence against O'Daly or most of the other accused men. According to Owen Kinsella, the inquiry's proceedings had revealed glaring weaknesses in the administrative practices of the civil and military branches of defence, particularly procurement and financial oversight. Over the following weeks and months, the Department of Finance and the civil side of the Department of Defence increased their control and influence on the Army's affairs. Increasingly tight management of financial expenditure, with all items requiring approval first by the Army Finance Officer and then by the Department of Finance, substantially decreased the Army's autonomy. Owen O'Duffy served as GOC and Inspector General of the Army until September 1924, and demonstrating his exceptional administrative skills, he oversaw the appointment of a new General Staff, as well as drafting and beginning to implement a new organisational structure for the Army. Padder McMahon, Hugo McNeill and Felix Cronin were appointed as Chief of Staff, Adjutant General and Quartermaster General, respectively. Under the new structure, 7 brigades of 27 battalions were distributed across 4 new commands: Western, Southern, Eastern and the Curragh training camp. O'Duffy also produced a series of reports offering recommendations on a host of issues, such as on discipline and morale, overhauling the chaplaincy, and reducing the rates of venereal diseases. He also addressed the issue of pride or lack of pride in the army, writing in his final report as GOC, "At the present time, I fear that our army is Irish in name only, and that any sign of esprit de corps is confined to a few scattered units. To be frank, we have a mercenary army, pure and simple. This is really not to be wondered at when you consider the composition of the forces. Our officers are mainly drawn from the ranks of the old IRA, our NCOs from the British Army, while the majority of the rank and file served in neither armies. Day after day for the past few years, we have listened to the irregulars declare that they are the rightful successors to every Irish soldier that ever fought in the nation's cause, to every military force that ever battled for Irish freedom, while the first Irish regular army since the days of Sarsfield, or indeed of Owen Rua, remained silent, apparently admitting that fact. While the army mutiny had a destabilising effect on the Free State, it also had one on the sensitive boundary negotiations that were ongoing throughout 1924. The Northern Ireland government and unionist-leaning newspapers from Belfast tried to take advantage of the mutiny by using it to continue their obstruction of the Boundary Commission and of maintaining its overly bloated Ulster Special Constabulary at its existing numbers. One Belfast-based newspaper suggested that the real reason for the mutiny was that a movement was on foot to declare a republic and attack Ulster, and the government's failure to assent to this programme precipitated a mutiny. The reasons for these alarmist reports are obvious, wrote the Free State government's North-Eastern Boundary Bureau. They are calculated to strengthen the northern position in regard to the Boundary Commission and to justify the continuation of the subsidies towards the maintenance of the Special Constabulary. The Boundary Bureau's assessment was correct. The Northern Government wrote to the British Home Secretary, Arthur Henderson, a letter saying the mutiny had strengthened those calling for a republic, who were notorious for their hostility to Northern Ireland, which causes the Northern Government very grave concern, and we therefore feel it essential to maintain all our constabulary forces at their present strength until the position is clear. Also stoking fears from the Free State Army mutiny, the Northern Ireland's Prime Minister, James Craig, told his cabinet he would seek a meeting with the British Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, to tell him that in his opinion, a republic was almost inevitable in the Free State, and that therefore it was only a question of the area to be included in that republic. An attempt to force the Northern Government under this republic would undoubtedly lead to bloodshed and disaster. There was little actual bloodshed itself in the army mutiny of March 1924, with it all ending very peacefully despite its potential to cause great harm. The Army Council accepted their lot, the mutineers were allowed to resign and escape punishment, and Mulcahy was quickly rehabilitated into government, becoming Minister for Local Government and Public Health in June 1927, and subsequently going on to serve as leader of Cumann na Gael's successor party, Fine Gael, for 16 years. The fallout from the army mutiny was a political victory for Kevin O'Higgins, who saw his position strengthened by the appointment of his secretary, Patrick McGilligan, to the Executive Council, increasing the so-called Donnybrook set influence within the cabinet. The mutiny resulted in the removal of the power of the secret societies within the army and brought it firmly under civilian control, a significant factor in ensuring that, unlike in other European countries at the time, the defence forces remained supportive and controlled by the Free State government, regardless of who took power. But thank you for your time. And next Tuesday, I will talk about the 1924 dissolution of Dublin Corporation, which lasted for over 6 years, not reconfigured until 1930. I will also, as I said, next Thursday, so next two talks next week. Next Thursday will be the talk on the Tailteann Games, the final talk of this series. Just finally, just some further reading. His is a really good introduction to the Irish Defence Forces, and he does cover the Army Mutiny quite extensively as well. You got there's a good few books you can read on General Richard Mulcahy. This book I mentioned here is out of print, but there's a book recently by Pádraig Ó Cuív as well, which covers the mutiny in detail. But I think it's interesting to get Mulcahy's perspective of the actual mutiny. And then one is not a book; it's actually a podcast series by great historian Brian Hanley. I think it's 6 episodes, and it's more so on the actual that so-called murder gang, the members of the squad, and their role in the Civil War. And it talks a bit about the actual mutiny, but it gives a real good insight into the people behind the mutiny, particularly what they did beforehand in the War of Independence and the Civil War. But it's an excellent podcast series. It's definitely worth a listen. Dirty War in Dublin.